On the morning of May 19, 1845, two British ships departed England. Beneath waves of celebration and almost unlimited confidence, their names were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were commanded by the veteran explorer Sir John Franklin. Their mission sounded simple and glorious: to discover the Northwest Passage, the legendary sea route through the Canadian Arctic that might connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and open a new path toward Asia. These were not fragile ships. Their hulls had been strengthened for the ice. They carried advanced equipment for their time and provisions expected to last for years. A total of 129 officers and men sailed aboard them, believing they would return as heroes of the British Empire. But they were entering a world that cared nothing for experience, rank, or ambition. In the Arctic, there were no reliable roads, only ice that moved like a living creature, darkness that lasted for months, and cold capable of killing a man before he understood he was dying. The two ships continued north. Ports disappeared behind them, then other vessels, then every easy chance of turning back. And after that, the fog swallowed their sails. The Franklin expedition vanished from the eyes of the world. Neither ship returned to England. Not one of the 129 men ever reached home. But the darkest part was not simply that they died. It was that the world would need more than a century and a half to begin understanding what happened to them inside the ice. Before the ice claimed them, the expedition looked like the greatest naval mission of the 19th century. Erebus and Terror were among the strongest ships in the Royal Navy. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plating to withstand crushing ice. They carried steam engines for use when the wind failed. And they were loaded with scientific instruments, a library, and thousands of preserved food tins believed to last for years. The crew did not leave in fear. Most believed they would return as heroes, remembered as the men who finally conquered the Northwest Passage. In late July 1845, two whaling ships encountered Franklin's expedition in Baffin Bay, west of Greenland. The sailors exchanged final waves. Then Erebus and Terror sailed north, disappearing among towering walls of ice. No one knew that this would become the last confirmed sighting of the entire expedition. Weeks passed, then months. No letters arrived. No ships returned. No trace of the 129 men was seen again. At first, Britain assumed the silence was normal. Polar expeditions often lasted for years, but as time passed, silence became concern, and concern became one of history's greatest exploration mysteries. One year passed, then another, and not a single message arrived from the Arctic. At first, no one panicked. Polar expeditions often disappeared from civilization for years, and many believed Franklin would return once the ice loosened its grip. But 1847 came, and the silence remained. Sir John Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, began urging the British government to launch search expeditions, convinced that something had gone terribly wrong. In the spring of 1848, the first rescue mission sailed north. Most believed the two ships had simply become trapped in the ice and that the crew was still alive, waiting for help. But with every mile they traveled, the mystery only deepened. There was no smoke, no sails on the horizon, no distress signals, not even the faintest sign that 129 men had ever crossed those endless fields of ice. The Arctic remained silent, as if it had erased the expedition from existence. Over the years, more search missions from Britain and the United States entered the frozen wilderness. But instead of finding the men, they found only fragments, a piece of metal, an abandoned food tin, scattered traces suggesting that something catastrophic had happened. Yet no one knew when it began or how it ended. 5 years had passed since the Franklin expedition disappeared. Then, in 1850, one of the search expeditions reached a small barren island known as Beechy Island. At first, the island appeared completely abandoned. But after hours of searching, the sailors noticed something unusual. A carefully built stone cairn, then the remains of an old campsite, and then 3 wooden graves standing in the frozen ground. The names carved into them belonged to 3 members of Franklin's expedition: John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Braine. It was the first undeniable proof that the expedition had reached this island, yet it offered no explanation for what happened next. The search teams continued exploring the island. They found the remains of workshops, empty food tins, campsites. Everything suggested that the crew had spent the winter there in relative order, then left as though nothing had gone wrong. But one terrifying question remained. If the men had left Beachy Island, where did they disappear afterward? There were no more bodies, no letters, no journals, only 3 lonely graves and an endless silence of snow and ice. Instead of solving the mystery, this discovery made it even more haunting. 9 years after the graves on Beachy Island were discovered, a new expedition led by explorer Francis McClintock reached King William Island. The searchers knew they might not find any survivors, but they still hoped to find at least one message. A few words explaining how an entire expedition had vanished. In the spring of 1859, a party led by Lieutenant William Hobson reached a place known as Victory Point. There, in a barren landscape covered by ice, they found an old stone cairn. The men began removing the rocks one by one, until a small metal container appeared beneath them, and inside, there was only a single sheet of paper. The document carried 2 messages, written at 2 different times. The first had been recorded in May 1847. It was calm and reassuring. It stated that the ships had spent their first winter at Beachy Island, and that they had been trapped in the ice since September 1846. Then it ended with 2 words that seemed completely ordinary. All well. Everything was fine. But less than a year later, someone returned to the same document and wrote a second message around its margins. This time, the reassurance was gone. The date was April 25th, 1848, and the message was signed by Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames. It revealed that Erebus and Terror had remained trapped in the ice since September 1846, and that the men had abandoned both ships on April 22nd, 1848. Then came the sentence that destroyed any remaining hope of finding the expedition's commander alive. Sir John Franklin had died on June 11th, 1847, and he was not the only one. By that date, 9 officers and 15 sailors had already died. 24 men. Before the final stage of the disaster had even begun, only 105 men remained alive, but they could no longer wait aboard the ships. Crozier wrote that the following day, they would begin marching south toward the Back River, searching for land, food, and any possible chance of survival. Hundreds of kilometers of ice and rock lay ahead of them. They would have to drag their equipment and boats with their own hands after 2 winters of cold, disease, and diminishing supplies. This document became the last confirmed message left by the expedition. At first, the men had written, "All well." Less than a year later, their commander was dead, their ships were abandoned, and nearly a quarter of their men had already perished. The survivors began moving south, and from the moment they walked away from the ships, they left no other message explaining what followed. Only scattered traces across the ice, and a long road that none of them would ever reach the end of. After abandoning the ships, the men had no shelter left. The 105 survivors dragged their boats and supplies across the frozen Arctic, marching south toward the Back River, hoping to find food or human settlement. But the Arctic offered no mercy. Hunger grew worse. The cold became deadly. Many collapsed along the journey, never to stand again. Years later, explorers and Inuit witnesses led search teams to scattered skeletons, boats mounted on sledges, and abandoned personal belongings. The evidence revealed that the expedition had become something very different. No longer a voyage of discovery, but a desperate march for survival. For more than a century, many believed the Inuit accounts of Franklin's final days were nothing more than difficult-to-believe stories. But as archaeology advanced, the evidence began to speak for itself. During the 1990s, researchers recovered hundreds of human bones from several sites on King William Island. When the remains were examined closely, they showed clear-cut marks made by sharp tools, along with broken bones consistent with extracting bone marrow. To archaeologists, these were unmistakable signs of desperate survival during extreme starvation. The most remarkable discovery was that these findings matched testimonies recorded from the Inuit more than 150 years earlier. Some Inuit witnesses described finding the remains of European sailors, cut bones, and evidence suggesting that the last survivors had resorted to consuming the dead after every other food source had disappeared. Today, these accounts are no longer dismissed as legends. They are supported by archaeological and scientific evidence, making them one of the most tragic chapters in the history of Arctic exploration. Yet despite everything the bones revealed, one question still remained unanswered. What drove an expedition equipped with the finest ships in the British Empire to such a devastating end? For more than 170 years, the greatest question was not how they died. It was, why did an expedition designed to be the finest in British history fail? Today, after decades of studying official records, examining human remains, and investigating the wrecks of the ships, researchers have assembled a much clearer picture. There was no single cause. Instead, it was a chain of disasters that began when Erebus and Terra became trapped in the Arctic ice in 1846. Then came another brutal polar winter. Food supplies steadily declined. Diseases such as scurvy and severe malnutrition weakened the crew, leaving many too exhausted to continue. Studies have also suggested that some canned food may have exposed the crew to lead, although modern researchers now believe lead was a contributing factor rather than the primary cause. As the ships remained locked in the ice, the crew made the hardest decision of all. They abandoned Erebus and Terra, setting out on foot across hundreds of kilometers of frozen wilderness. But the men were already exhausted. They were starving, and they were dragging heavy boats and supplies across one of the harshest environments on Earth. With every step, their chances of survival grew smaller. In the end, they were not defeated by the ice alone. They were overwhelmed by the combined weight of starvation, disease, exhaustion, isolation, and the impossible decisions forced upon them by nature. The expedition possessed the most advanced ships of its era, yet it faced a force that no technology of the 19th century could overcome. After the Victory Point note was discovered, the world knew that the surviving men had abandoned both ships in April 1848. But one strange question remained. How could two enormous ships disappear without leaving a visible wreck? For more than a century, search expeditions explored the coasts and waters of the Canadian Arctic. They found bones, equipment, and abandoned camps. But Erebus and Terra remained missing. The mystery deepened because the wrecks were eventually found far from the position where the ships had reportedly been abandoned. This suggests that drifting ice may have carried them away, or that at least one vessel moved again after the crew departed. But this remains an interpretation, not a confirmed fact. The Inuit, however, preserved stories passed down through generations. Some accounts described a ship seen near the coast and wooden or metal objects recovered from European vessels. This traditional knowledge eventually became a crucial part of the modern searches, alongside sonar and underwater archaeology. In 2008, Parks Canada's underwater archaeology team began a new series of searches. Year after year, modern vessels scanned the seabed, but ice, severe weather, and the immense search area made the mission extremely difficult. Then, in September 2014, a clear shape appeared on a sonar screen beneath the Arctic water. A long wooden hull, collapsed masts, and the unmistakable outline of a ship hidden for more than a century and a half. One of Franklin's lost ships had finally returned from the darkness, but its identity, and what waited inside, would open an entirely new chapter of the mystery. In September 2014, one of the greatest mysteries in the history of exploration finally came to an end. After years of searching, Parks Canada announced the discovery of HMS Erebus in the waters of Queen Maud Gulf, using modern archaeological surveys and knowledge preserved for generations by the Inuit. But the surprise did not end there. Just 2 years later, in September 2016, an Inuit hunter guided researchers to another location, deep beneath the Arctic waters. The second ship appeared. It was HMS Terror. Even more astonishing, its condition was far better than anyone had expected. The ship rested almost upright on the seabed, as if time itself had stopped. Doors, windows, officers' cabins, and many original objects remained preserved by the freezing Arctic water and the lack of wood-destroying organisms. When cameras entered the wreck, the corridors were dark and silent. The crew's belongings still rested where they had been left, as though the sailors had walked away only moments before. Yet this discovery did not end the mystery. It created an even greater one. If both ships were preserved so remarkably, what secrets are they still hiding beneath the Arctic Sea? The Franklin expedition sailed with the greatest hopes of the British Empire. Its mission seemed simple: to discover the Northwest Passage. Instead, it ended in a way no one could have imagined. Out of 129 men, not a single one returned alive. It took more than 170 years for the truth to emerge, one piece at a time. A brief message left behind by the survivors. Bones that revealed the marks of starvation. Inuit testimony later confirmed by science. And finally, the two ships that returned from the depths after more than a century and a half. Today, the Franklin expedition is one of the most thoroughly studied expeditions in the history of exploration. Yet it remains one of its greatest mysteries, because we now know how it ended. But we may never know what the crew experienced during their final days. What was their last night like? Who was the last survivor? What were the final words spoken across that silent Arctic ice? Those answers may have been buried by nature forever. Or perhaps they still lie hidden within Erebus and Terra, where not every compartment has been explored, not every artifact has been recovered, and archaeological research continues to this day. And so, the Franklin expedition was never just the story of two lost ships. It became a reminder that no matter how advanced humanity becomes, nature can still have the final word. Perhaps that is the greatest secret Franklin left behind.